Thank you for joining us tonight for Community Conversations about Vaccines. This event is organized by the Massachusetts chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics and Team Maureen with our partners, the Martha's Vineyard Vaccine Task Force and Health Imperatives on Nantucket, and with the generous support of Cape Cod Healthcare and the MCAAP. I'm Kelly Welch. I'm the Executive Director of Team Maureen. We're a nonprofit located in Falmouth, dedicated to ending cervical cancer by educating about the connection between HPV and cancer and the importance of prevention through vaccination and early detection of cancer through regular screenings. Cynthia, I'm going to turn it over to you for our introduction of Dr. Moriarty.
It's my pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Richard Moriarty this evening. Dr. Moriarty is a graduate of Colby College, the University of Vermont College of Medicine. He completed his pediatric training at Johns Hopkins Hospital and also the University of Rochester. He then went to and spent more than 2 decades working at the Walter Reed Medical Center and National Naval Medical Center in pediatric infectious disease. After that, he came to Massachusetts, for which we were really grateful, and practiced at UMass School of Medicine and UMass Memorial Medical Center for 15 years, was it, Rick, as well? So he's been a member of our immunization initiative and co-director at the Mass Chapter American Academy of Pediatrics, and we're really delighted that you can talk with us today. So take it away, Rick. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you, Claudine and Eileen, for the amazing presentations, the amazing stories that you tell. I'm going to go back a little bit more in history, looking at life before we had the vaccines that we do now. This is a picture of my sister and me when I was in kindergarten. And there weren't many immunizations on my immunization record that my mother sent me while I was in medical school. We got
Rick, I'm just gonna interrupt you. Would you, I'm not seeing your slides, so would you mind just sharing them again? Perfect, thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry for that.
No problem.
My mother sent me my immunization record when I was in medical school, and back at the time when I was young, this is a picture of my sister and me when I was in kindergarten. There were very few immunizations that we had available. Basically an old form of the diphtheria, whooping cough, tetanus vaccine and smallpox vaccine were the only vaccines available. And my mother dutifully wrote down the date when I had measles and German measles and chickenpox and mumps. When I was 7 years old, polio vaccine came along, and then my record started to get a little bit bigger. As far as vaccines go. Life before vaccines, though, was deadly for many children and many people. Diphtheria, polio in particular, when I was growing up, was a horrible problem, and parents were scared to let their kids go out in the summertime. And hundreds and sometimes in several years, thousands of kids died from polio. The vaccine, fortunately, came out in 1955. Measles, which we very rarely, if ever, see anymore, had as many as 750,000 cases in its top year, and 500 kids a year died from measles before the vaccine came along. Rubella caused all sorts of birth defects, and a number of babies were born with very severe defects, both in their heart, in their eyes, in their hearing, in their brain development. Vaccine finally came along in 1969. Hib, which is a bacterial disease that was the major cause of meningitis, was a fear that many pediatricians had. When was their next case going to come in? Because this was so common. Vaccines came along as my children were growing up, and fortunately, that's not something we had to worry about. Chickenpox, which we think of as a benign childhood disease, used to kill 100 children a year and hospitalize another 10,000. And one of the things that we know about chickenpox is if you get the chickenpox, there's a 30% chance over the course of your life that you will get shingles. And now with the chickenpox vaccine that prevents the original chickenpox infection, we're going to be seeing less and less shingles as time goes on. Rotavirus causes horrible diarrhea almost every spring in so many places in the US and many, many more places overseas. And since the vaccine has come along for that, the number of hospitalizations and severe illnesses and ER visits has dramatically dropped off. And one of the it's a good news and bad news that many physicians who are going through their training now never get a chance to see these diseases, which is good because they're not happening, but bad because they may not know to suspect them. Life before HPV vaccine was something that we're still in the process of working through. There are about 5.5 million new cases of HPV disease every year. It can cause genital warts, which are inconvenient and not very nice looking, but they usually don't cause major problems in themselves. But HPV can cause a variety of different kinds of cancers. You've heard one story about the devastating effects of cervical cancer. It can also cause anal cancer, other genital cancers, and in men, it can cause head and neck cancers. And since we've seen the vaccine approved, we've seen decrease in some of these things I'll show you in just a minute here. Life since vaccines have eradicated smallpox. We no longer need to immunize against smallpox because our immunizations wiped out the disease. Hopefully, in our lifetime, we'll be able to see polio eradicated. We're very, very close now, and then we will no longer have to immunize against polio. Rubella has been virtually eliminated from the United States, but it still happens in many countries overseas. Invasive Hib disease is very, very rare, and meningitis from that disease has almost fallen off the radar screen. Chickenpox is much less common now, and the most common place where we're seeing that is when a case pops up in an unimmunized group of children, and then the disease spreads. Invasive pneumococcal pneumonia is much less common since we have been immunizing children. And one of the interesting side effects of this vaccine is when children get the vaccine, adults, particularly elder adults in their environment, are also less likely to get that pneumonia too, even without being immunized. Rotavirus, we're seeing when children are vaccinated, children get sick less and adults get sick less with rotavirus because kids do a great job of spreading some of these diseases around. And when we immunize kids, we protect adults. Life since HPV vaccine has not been very long at this point. We have, the vaccine was first approved in 2006. So we have only 14 years of experience with this vaccine, but we've already seen a dramatic drop in genital warts in many places around the world. We've also seen drops in cervical precancers, and the cervical cancer rate has now been falling for almost 2 decades. We hope in the future that this will lead to the elimination of HPV-related cervical cancers. We know that there's a better immune response to this vaccine when children get it when they're younger rather than waiting until they're older teenagers. Vaccine, we're finding out now, can protect against oral HPV infection, and that this will likely lead to the decrease in head and neck cancers related to HPV in the future. This vaccine is safe. It's been around now for 14 years. There have been more than 120 million doses in the US and more than double that given on a worldwide basis, and no abnormal signs of unusual side effects from that. And we know that broader use of this vaccine could prevent some 43,000 HPV-related cancers every year. Today, children are healthier and safer because of vaccines. Yes, the list has gotten longer. Yes, we give more immunizations to children than we did when I was growing up, but these vaccines are safer now, they're improved, and the fact that we are able to protect against these kids with a smaller number of antigens than in the few vaccines that we had in 1980 shows that we have improved our ability to study and make these vaccines safer and more effective. How are vaccines developed? Well, physicians and researchers look at the diseases that cause injury and disability and death. They look at how common certain diseases are. They look at what ages that they occur at. And then they decide, can we detect this disease? Can we detect immunity to it? Can we test a vaccine in animals to make sure it works? We know that very few pharmaceutical companies actually invest in vaccines because the return for many of them is not very good. We know that very, very few vaccines that start out in test tubes or start out in laboratory animals, very few of them make it to the point where they're approved for human use. And drug companies can make more money on cancer drugs and immunotherapy medications, and even medicines like Viagra, more than they can from vaccines. We are also looking over history at how vaccines could be improved, and several of the vaccines that we have now today are much better and safer than they were 15 or 20 years ago because of improved research into making them better. This is a complicated slide, and I'd just like to walk you through some of it so you can understand a little bit about how vaccines are approved. Vaccines are tested usually in test tubes and then in animals before they go anywhere near humans. And then they go through a series of steps. Phase 1 studies, which is a small number of healthy volunteers, to look at, is the vaccine safe? Does the vaccine work? Are there serious side effects? And what's the right dose? If a vaccine makes it through this phase, then it goes on to phase 2, where there are several hundred volunteers. And again, what they're looking for is, what are the common short-term side effects and how do the immune systems respond? Phase 3 usually is hundreds or thousands of volunteers. And again, the same questions are asked. Who is the vaccine right for? Is it safe? Is it effective? Does it prevent disease? These phases are very expensive for pharmaceutical companies to run through. Phase 1 usually costs millions of dollars. Phase 2 is tens of millions of dollars. And phase 3 is hundreds of millions of dollars. So many drug companies don't pour money into something that may not be likely to pan out. All along the way with these phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, there are what are called data safety monitoring boards that are looking at every record, every test result, every patient, every side effect to make sure that the vaccine is safe. They can stop a trial if they feel that there are side effects that are concerning. We know that in the proof of a vaccine being safe and effective comes from the phase 3 trials. This is a phase that absolutely cannot be glossed over. Efficacy refers to how effective the vaccine is in preventing disease in a controlled situation. Effectiveness is how good a vaccine is in real life, not in study conditions. We're going to talk a little bit more about Operation Warp Speed later on. But for a minute, for routine vaccines, usually this data is presented to the Food and Drug Administration, and the vaccine is licensed only if it's safe and effective. Once it's licensed, the vaccine companies start to manufacture it. The government oversees the manufacturing process. And from there, Um, from there, the vaccine goes to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which has a whole different group of physicians and scientists to look at everything that the FDA has already looked at again to make sure that all the I's have been dotted, all the T's have been crossed, and to make recommendations now for, again, is the vaccine safe and effective? What ages should it be given at? And is the vaccine cost effective? If the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices says yes, the vaccine is added to the routine pediatric vaccine schedule. But even then, that's not done being examined, because after a vaccine has been FDA licensed and approved and added to the schedule, there are multiple places that look at the vaccine safety and look for unusual side effects that may occur very, very rarely. The first is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. This is a sentinel system, just like radar. It picks up little blips on the screen but doesn't identify specifically what those blips are. The Adverse Event Reporting System records a potential side effect or something that has happened after a vaccine. And then people at the Centers for Disease Control study this to see if it's being reported from multiple places. There are also several studies, several groups across the country that are looking at large populations in managed care settings and in other settings to pick up side effects which potentially were not noticed in smaller studies. And a couple of these, Harvard Pilgrim Health Plan is involved in one of these monitoring groups, and Boston Medical Center is involved in another. So this is a very, very sensitive way of picking up rare or unusual side effects that may not have been found in the original studies. Because COVID vaccine has been so new, there was an additional system that was added to look for unusual side effects when COVID vaccines were rolled out. It's called vSafe. It's a smartphone-based tool that allows the Centers for Disease Control to check in with you after you've had your vaccine. You sign up for this program by looking at aiming your phone at a QR code and registering. And then every day, vSafe will send you a note to find out, how are you doing? Do you have any new or unusual side effects? And this system has, again, allowed us to continue to track the safety of the COVID vaccines as they have been rolled out to more and more people. How is the vaccine schedule developed in general for pediatric patients? Well, the vaccines are developed, of course, to prevent diseases. And we know that the vaccine should be given before the diseases come along or before they're likely to happen. They should also be, of course, safe and cost ineffective. Pertussis, whooping cough, causes severe problems for children less than a year of age. That's why we start that vaccine so early in life. Pneumonia and Hib disease and rotavirus used to cause severe problems in kids under age 2. That's why we start those diseases early in life. Measles and chickenpox, however, usually are not a problem until after age 1 year of age. And that's because kids get some passively transferred immunity from mother during pregnancy to help protect the baby until the baby's about a year old. Hepatitis B vaccine is given to newborns. Most people who get hepatitis B get it as a sexually transmitted disease, but hepatitis B can be passed from mother to baby. And if the baby is infected with hepatitis B, there's up to a 90% chance that that child is going to have long-term liver disease, may develop liver cancer later in life, and need a liver transplant. That's why that vaccine is given when it is. How are vaccine studies set up? Again, we've looked a little bit at that with the information about phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3. But as vaccines are studied, usually they are studied, a new vaccine is added into the schedule during trials to make sure it doesn't interfere with immunity to other vaccines that kids are receiving. We know that many studies are done with placebo controls. The polio vaccine trials in 1954 were placebo-controlled studies. And all of the COVID vaccine trials have been done with placebos also. Why are some vaccines required for school? Well, most of the vaccines that are required for school, virtually all of them, are diseases that could be passed either by respiratory droplets or by contact in a school or nursery or daycare situation. Again, these diseases, particularly like measles and chickenpox and flu, can be passed around in those settings. And so schools want to require those things to make school not a place where you can go to pick up diseases, but a place where you can go to learn and otherwise be healthy. School immunization rates in Massachusetts are pretty darn good. We have very, very high rates of immunizations for virtually all of the diseases for kindergarten entry. And across the state, our exemption rate is only about 1.1%. However, what we do know is that there are some places, the Cape and Islands and in Western Massachusetts, where the exemption rate is higher, which can set up the potential for an outbreak situation. If we look at another map, the blue dots represent kindergartens, the red dots represent 7th graders, and the bigger the dot, the more exemptions there are for vaccines in those schools. And when vaccine exemption rates get up into the 10 or higher percentage range, that's a setup for a measles outbreak. It's a setup for a chickenpox outbreak. And these are some of the things that we want to work on to keep the exemption rates low so we won't set ourselves up for disease outbreaks in various places in our state. We know that under-immunized communities are setups for outbreaks. And this has happened in a number of places around the country. A measles outbreak in Ohio in an under-immunized community. A measles outbreak in Minneapolis, Minnesota in an under-immunized community. A big outbreak of measles in New York a couple of years ago in an under-immunized community. This cost New York $8.4 million to deal with and to stop. Outbreaks in Russian Orthodox community in Washington state. And you probably all read or heard about the measles outbreak on Samoa, where the immunization rate for measles was only 31%. And in a matter of a few months, they had 5,700 cases and 83 children died of measles from which should have been able to be prevented. These are pictures of a little girl I saw a number of years ago with measles. And measles is a derivation of the word meaning miserable. And it's a very apt description of how these kids are. They have high fevers, dry, grassy coughs, red eyes, and they're just very, very uncomfortable. It's not a disease we want to see in our population. Plus, it can have very significant and devastating side effects too. We know around the world, unfortunately, that vaccine hesitancy is becoming a real problem. And 2 years ago, the World Health Organization said it was one of the top 10 threats to global health. There was a poll in September 2020 saying 50% of Americans would refuse the COVID-19 vaccine. A more recent edition of this poll said that that number had been down to 20% as people learned more about how safe the COVID vaccines are. During the pandemic in 2020, we saw a number of problems that were set up by the pandemic. The blue bars in this chart show the number of vaccines that were given every month in Massachusetts, and the orange bars show the number that were given the next year during the pandemic. And we can see for almost every month, the immunization rate in Massachusetts fell off for many vaccines, by as much as 64% decrease in some months during the pandemic. And that means children are unprotected from these diseases. We also saw a drop-off in cervical cancer screening, PAP screening, and HPV immunizations too, leaving teens and women unprotected from cervical cancer and cervical cancer. We know that pandemics and vaccine hesitancy plus vaccine delays can lead to longer pandemics and other diseases. We know that many of these diseases are circulating at low levels, and we know that as soon as travel opens up, people are going to be coming from areas of the world where there are more of these diseases, and that can set us up for more outbreaks. Hopefully at some point the pandemic will be gone. The numbers recently are very encouraging, but we are only a plane ride away from many places in the world where many of these diseases are ongoing. And we need to keep our immunization coverage up as high as we can to prevent outbreaks when we reopen. This is a slide from the Johns Hopkins coronavirus billboard that is updated almost multiple times during every day. I picked up this screenshot of it this morning, and you can see we are inching close to 600,000 people in the United States who have died from COVID during this pandemic. 600,000. That's like wiping out the city of Milwaukee. And could we ever imagine that a death toll from a disease in this day and age would be that high? But it's something we had to look at. We know that our friends in Brazil are having almost as bad a pandemic as we are at this point. And there's indications that their pandemic may even be picking up steam. This is a tragedy. This is something that we really have to work to wipe out. COVID is a public health problem, and immunization can stop this pandemic. And please spread the word around. This vaccine program is open to all residents of Massachusetts, regardless of immunization status. Anyone over the age of 12 who lives in Massachusetts can sign up and get this vaccine if they are medically cleared to be vaccinated. And no one will ask about immigration status. No one will require immunization paperwork, and no one should ask you to pay for this vaccine. This is very important, and it's important to get this word out to everybody. Some people ask about how these mRNA vaccines work because they had not been used before. And if I can give you just a short immunology lesson here, this is the coronavirus. The blue squiggly line in the middle here is the genome, the genes of this virus that tell it how to reproduce. They've taken the gene that makes the spike protein, and they've made the messenger RNA that gives that instruction on how to make the spike protein. They covered it in a lipid coating to help it get into our cells better. And then the lipid-coated mRNA goes into our cells. The messenger RNA instructs our cells how to make the spike protein, And then the messenger RNA disappears. It doesn't last in our system more than about 48 hours. And then the spike protein comes out, it stimulates our immune system to make antibodies. And those are the antibodies that help us fight off COVID when it comes along. COVID-19 disease happens in children. They can get the disease, although what we have seen so far in the pandemic is most of the disease has been in the elderly. We know that more and more cases now are occurring in children. Children can get the disease, they can spread it. They can be either symptomatic or asymptomatic, and they can develop severe COVID disease too, particularly children who have underlying conditions like respiratory diseases or cardiac or cancers or obesity. These are all risk factors for more severe COVID disease. There's an unusual, fortunately, side effect that some children have from COVID. It's called multisystem inflammatory syndrome caused by COVID. And it's affected some 4,000 kids across the country so far. These kids are very, very ill. They end up in intensive care. They often need to be ventilated, and some of them have died. We know that this is probably a delayed immune response to the virus too. We also know that as of the end of May, there had been some 3.8 million pediatric cases of COVID-19 disease across the country, and some 307 kids had died from it. We know that with the vaccine being approved down to age 18 for a Pfizer vaccine, that some 2.3 million kids less than 18 have gotten the vaccine, and there have been no pediatric deaths in this group. So for the little pediatric experience we have, coupled with the large adult experience that we have, this vaccine appears to be safe and effective. The vaccine is now approved for 12 and above for Moderna vaccine, and they are in the process of doing studies down to age 6 now. And what they're finding out is that it probably is going to be a lower dose of vaccine that is used in the younger kids to decrease the chance of reactions a bit. Any kids who are getting the vaccine can sign up for the V-Safe program to help monitor their side effects and help teach us all about how this vaccine is working. More unvaccinated children are being infected by variants and hospitalized. In the last 2 weeks, there have been some 25% of all recent cases have been reported in children. And again, more than 2.3 million kids less than 18, most of them between 16 and 18, have been immunized so far with these vaccines, and no safety signals have been detected. Important points to know about the COVID vaccines. Reactions to these vaccines are normal. Many people, the story that they tell is that they have very little reaction to the first dose, and more strong reaction to the second dose is possible. But arm soreness is possible, fatigue, malaise, headache, fever are things that frequently happen, particularly with the second dose. The reactions are a good indication that your immune system is working, and these reactions very rarely last more than a day or two. COVID vaccines are not live COVID viruses. They don't change your DNA. They cannot physically get into the nucleus part of your cell to cause that. There's no evidence that they affect fertility or menstrual periods. There's no evidence that they have long-term effects on health so far. And you can't get COVID-19 or the flu from these vaccines. They don't contain microchips or tracking devices. They don't make you metallic like some people have, or magnetic like some people have said. And there is a federal program called the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program that may help pay in case there are rare damages that are shown to be coming from the vaccines. There's no preservatives, no adjuvants, no fetal cells, and no eggs in these vaccines. We were skeptical and worried about this, and before the vaccines were approved in the late summer and fall of 2020, I was as hesitant as anybody about these vaccines because of political pressure that appeared to be being exerted on the FDA to approve the vaccines. This fortunately turned out not to be the case. And what we have found is that these vaccines have been shown to be effective so far, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second here. But it's normal to be doubtful about these vaccines, and I want to tell you a few things why I think it's helpful not to be doubtful. We know that Operation Warp Speed was an effort to get a vaccine to the people in a very quick form. And I think a lot of people were very concerned that steps were going to be skipped, that all the testing that was done was not going to be done. And that's not the case. What really happened with Operation Warp Speed is the red tape was cut out. Phase 2 and phase 3, instead of being done sequentially, one after the other, were done at the same time. Manufacturing, which never is done before a vaccine has been finally tested, was done at the same time as phase 2 and 3 testing. Distribution of the vaccine was done before it was approved. That helped condense the timeline down so this vaccine could get to us more quickly in a safe way without sacrificing the appropriate testing that needed to be done. This was an astounding worldwide effort to develop this vaccine with the idea that none of us are safe until everyone is safe. And as of June 1st, there were actually 287 COVID-19 vaccines in development around the world, and 102 of them in clinical trials. And the chance of a vaccine that has reached clinical trial actually going on to be approved is only 17%. Normally, what we would see is one or maybe two companies working on a vaccine at the same time. If that had been the case with the COVID vaccines, we probably would still be looking for a successful vaccine. But the World Health Organization is looking at 16 vaccines in various stages of review and approval. Global alliances have been working together to manufacture vaccines to help facilitate it. And in Brazil, for instance, there are now actually 6 vaccines that are being distributed and used across the country to help stem the tide of their outbreak. In just 18 months for COVID-19, we've come an incredibly long way. We've sequenced the genetics of the virus. We've developed tests for virus and antibodies. We have found ways to improve the hospital care of people who do have to be hospitalized. We've looked at the social distancing and ventilation and masks to slow down the spread. We've now got 4 vaccines that are being used to prevent the disease in this country. We've identified multiple variants, and that continues to be a problem. As long as there's virus circulating, there can be new variants that develop. We've got antibody cocktails that have been shown to help fight severe disease. They have to be given IV. And there are now actually 1 or 2 medicines that they're looking at for oral use for COVID-19. And all of this we owe to science. COVID vaccine and pregnancy is the last thing I wanted to close with here. COVID-19 disease we know is more severe in pregnant women. And since the vaccine was approved, there have been more than 121,000 pregnant women who have gotten this vaccine with no safety signals, no fetal anomalies in the babies whose mothers have had COVID during pregnancy, and no indications that these vaccines would cause harm to a pregnant woman. We also are finding out that COVID antibodies from mother's vaccine get into breast milk, temporarily protect the baby, and get into mother's blood and are temporarily also protecting the baby. So these vaccines are important to think about during pregnancy. And I will show you a picture here. This is my daughter-in-law, and she was great with child. Might be an understatement to think about. She had done the research on COVID vaccine. She had talked to her obstetrician about it. Her obstetrician recommended that she get the vaccine. I seconded that recommendation. She went to get her vaccine. She and my son live in New Jersey. She got to the vaccine center, and the vaccine center said, "Are you pregnant?" And she said, "Yes, I am." And they said, "I'm sorry, New Jersey law says you can't get the vaccine when you're pregnant." She was very determined. She went home, put on a disguise, came back, told them that she was not pregnant, and she got her dose of vaccine. Just 1 week ago today, she delivered healthy 7-pound, 12-ounce Loretta. And that's something that our family has been rejoicing about for the last week. I volunteered at several COVID immunization clinics over the last several months, and on one of the last clinics that I worked at, my daughter came in for her second dose, and I actually got to give my daughter her second dose. And my point in showing these pictures is to say, I would never, and I have never in 50 years of pediatric practice, recommended anything that I would not recommend or do for my own family. So I have a great deal of confidence in these vaccines, and I hope I have been able to pass some of that confidence on to you too. History was made in 1980 when the world was declared free of smallpox. Polio is very close to being eradicated, and we have the potential to eradicate measles and rubella with the immunizations that we have. And we could eliminate or certainly decrease HPV-related cancers with vaccines. So get your vaccines for yourself, for those you love, for those who can't get the vaccines, to prevent variants from developing and to stop this pandemic. We can do it if we immunize. There's some very good references, and if folks would like more information, there are places where you can go to get more information. Immunize.org does have some information in Portuguese available too. So thank you to the folks who have put this seminar together, and I'll turn this back over to Kelly.